What if I told you? The world once trembled before a man who rose from the endless steppes. He was not born in a palace. He was born beneath the open sky, with nothing but hunger, betrayal, and the whisper of destiny. His name was Temüjin, the boy abandoned in chains, the warrior forged in exile, the conqueror who would become Genghis Khan. From the dust of Mongolia, he united tribes that had warred for centuries. From the saddle of his horse, he built an empire that stretched further than Rome, larger than Alexander, greater than any kingdom the world had ever seen. His armies rode like thunder, his banners carried fear across deserts, rivers and mountains. Yet behind the power and glory there was blood, there was fire, there were secrets whispered only in the winds of the steppe. This is the story of Genghis Khan, the rise of a man who reshaped the earth, the shadow of conquest he left behind. And the strange silence history tries to place upon his name. Watch till the end, because once you see how the world was changed by one rider on the steppe, you'll understand why his story still echoes today. If you're new here, like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Now close your eyes and return with me to the empire of Genghis Khan, where the steppe gave birth to the storm. The wind rarely paused on the Mongolian steppe. It carried dust across the grasslands, swept through the cracks of felt yurts, and rattled the bones of those who slept beneath the open sky. Here, in a world with no walls and no cities, a child named Temüjin was born around the year 1162. He did not enter history with thunder, nor with prophecy. He arrived as most steppe children did, wrapped in animal skins, warmed by dung fire, and placed beside his mother, Holun, who had been stolen from her first husband by Temüjin's father, Yesugei. The boy's name, Temüjin, may have come from a Tatar warrior his father had defeated. A tradition of naming sons after enemies, either to claim strength or curse revenge, was common among the Mongol tribes. But at the time, it meant nothing to anyone but his mother. He was one of many sons, one of many boys born into the hum of horses and the distant threat of neighbouring tribes. Temüjin's early life was not one of conquest or grandeur. It was filled with monotony and survival, herding goats, repairing saddles, waiting for storms to pass while listening to adults argue over grazing rights and trade. These weren't the tales that filled epic scrolls or inspired songs, but these were the things that mattered. When food would run out, when rival tribes would raid, when a family might have to flee in the night because an old alliance had frayed. Yesugei was not a powerful Khan. He was a respected chieftain of the Borjigin clan, but that respect came with enemies. He understood the dangers of power among the Mongols, where loyalties shifted with the wind and betrayal came faster than sunrise. So, when Temüjin was only 9, Yesugei decided to secure his son's future by arranging a marriage. Borte, the girl chosen for Temüjin, lived among the Ongirat. It was a match not of romance but of strategy, a union that could forge new alliances, but even this minor step into Mongol diplomacy would not be smooth. Yesugei died shortly after leaving his son with the Ongirat, poisoned, it was said, by Tatars who served him tainted food, recognizing his face but hiding their knives until the meal was done. Temüjin, unaware of his father's death, waited patiently to be called back. But no summons came. When he returned home, led by a sympathetic messenger, he found not the comfort of family but the slow erosion of everything he knew. Without Yesugei, his family lost their protection. Other Borjigin leaders turned their backs on Holun and her children. Their livestock was taken, their camp was abandoned. And so, Holun led her children to live alone, eating roots, hunting rats, and surviving on whatever they could gather. This wasn't noble. This was humiliation. And for Temüjin, it was a lesson in how fast power vanishes and how easily allies become scavengers. It's easy to skip this part when telling the story of Genghis Khan, to move quickly from exile to empire, but that would miss the quiet truth of his greatness. The man who would later conquer half the known world began with absolutely nothing. No horses, no army, no food, just a disgraced family and the memory of a father who believed in a marriage that hadn't yet begun. Temüjin hunted squirrels with arrows made from splintered branches. He and his brothers argued over scraps. One day his half-brother Bekta took more food than was fair, asserting his dominance as the oldest. Temüjin killed him with a bow, There was no ceremony, no drama, just a boy drawing a line. This was not cruelty, it was survival. On the steppe, power wasn't inherited, it was taken. The murder left a permanent mark. For some, it was a sign of ruthless ambition. For others, a calculated move to protect his siblings. Either way, it was a turning point, a foreshadowing of how Temüjin would later rule, decisive, unflinching, and loyal only to those who shared his hardship. His adolescence was a blur of cold nights, bitter roots, and distrust. The Mongols had no written laws, but they remembered slights. Loyalty was a slippery currency, and yet, slowly, Temüjin began to build something from the ashes. He reconnected with blood allies, made peace with former enemies. And most of all, he learned to wait. It was in these years, not during his conquests, that the foundation of his empire was built. In patience, in watching, in knowing that power taken too soon would only burn the hand. By the time he was in his late teens, Temüjin had already endured betrayal, exile, starvation, murder, and abandonment. He had not yet fought a single major battle, but he had learned the first rule of steppe politics. The world does not care who you are, only what you can survive. As the wind scratched across the plains and the stars flickered above his family's tattered tent, one question must have haunted him. If power could disappear overnight, what kind of world could he build where it wouldn't? After years of clawing through exile, Temüjin was no longer the helpless boy his father's death had left behind. His face had hardened, carved by hunger and wind. His hands, once small and trembling in the cold, now moved with quiet precision, fashioning arrowheads, adjusting harnesses, knotting rope, negotiating whispers into allegiance. But survival was not the same as safety. Temüjin's rising presence among scattered Borjigin clans stirred discomfort. He was still young, not yet 20, and yet something in him unsettled the elders. His calm, his silence, the way others began to listen when he stood. The steppe had seen sons of chieftains before, but not one who carried exile like a banner and hunger like a knife. Then, one spring morning, while travelling with a small band of loyal kin, Temüjin was ambushed and taken prisoner, not by foreign raiders, but by the Temüjin, his own extended kin group. They saw in him a threat, or perhaps a reminder of what they had cast aside. The arrest was not violent. There was no battle, just an offer of meat, a few casual greetings, and then suddenly arms from behind. The betrayal was bloodless but cold. They bound him with a heavy wooden collar, a kang, not built for torture, but for humiliation, a yoke that made running impossible and sleep unbearable. He could not lie down, he could not lift his arms. At night, the collar pulled his spine into pain. By day, it declared his shame. The Temüjin didn't kill him. They watched. They waited to see what would happen. Would the boy's allies come? Would he beg? Would he break? He did neither. Temüjin endured. The other slaves and prisoners around him watched him closely. Most whispered about his quiet defiance. Others feared it. He refused to grovel. He spoke rarely. And when he did, he asked not for mercy, but for water or silence. One boy, Chilaun, a member of the Temüjin, saw something different in Temüjin. He had heard stories about how this prisoner once killed a brother over stolen food, how he wandered the steppe alone, how he was rebuilding a camp from ash. It was not loyalty nor pity that made Chilaun act. It was awe. One night, while the guards were drunk and the stars were heavy, Chilaun unfastened the kang and led Temüjin quietly away from the camp. They didn't run. They moved slowly. The wind covered their steps. The collar was thrown into a stream. When morning came, Temüjin was gone. This escape wasn't just a moment of liberation. It was a new lesson in power. Power did not only come from blades or bloodlines. It came from silence, from the belief others placed in you even when you had no throne, no armor, and no name. That night, a teenage fugitive with no camp, no herd, and no land was worth betraying a tribe for. That meant something. Temüjin's return was quiet. He didn't seek revenge, not yet. He didn't raise a banner. Instead, he returned to those who still whispered his name with respect. One by one, he began forming new alliances, not based on tribe, but on loyalty. He promised spoils not only to the aristocrats, but to common herders and servants who would ride for him. In a world still ruled by bloodline, this was revolutionary. dangerous. Meanwhile, Borte, the girl to whom he'd been promised in marriage, had waited. Years had passed, but the Ongirat had not forgotten the agreement with Yesugei. Temüjin returned for her now, not with a caravan, but with a handful of horsemen. The marriage was humble, the dowry was modest. But in this union, something far greater was taking shape. Borte was no pawn. She was clever, steadfast, and calm in storms, qualities Temüjin came to depend on for the rest of his life. Their time together, however, was cut short. Not long after their reunion, a band of Merkits, rival raiders with a long-standing feud against Temüjin's family, descended on their camp. It wasn't a battle, it was a raid. Fast, brutal. Borte was stolen. For a moment it seemed the exile would repeat. The cycle of loss would begin again. But Temüjin did not retreat. He turned to an old friend, Jamuka. Once childhood blood brothers, Temüjin and Jamuka had grown apart in the political chaos of the steppe. But now, with Borte gone, Temüjin needed allies. Together they launched a retaliatory raid. Within days they tracked the Merkits, scattered their camp, and recovered Borte. The rescue wasn't just a personal victory, it was a declaration. Temüjin was no longer a boy scavenging roots. He had learned how to move, when to ask, when to strike. But Jamuka and Temüjin were two different men. Jamuka came from a noble line. He believed in old hierarchies, in traditions that favoured the aristocratic Mongol blood. Temüjin believed in earned loyalty. To Jamuka, power came from birth. To Temüjin, it came from suffering. Their bond, once sealed in childhood, began to crack. Though the two still rode together, a silent rift widened with every decision made. Who got spoils, who led patrols, who gave orders to whom? It was not war, yet. But the future loomed like a dust storm on the horizon. Meanwhile, Temüjin's own camp grew slowly. He didn't call himself Khan. He didn't dress like royalty. But he began organising. Small things at first. Structured herding schedules, clear punishment for theft, fair distribution of food in lean months. He favoured merit, promoted those who served well, and asked hard questions when things went wrong. To outsiders, it may have looked like a band of poor nomads living on the edge of power, but to those inside, it was already an empire in its bones. He allowed warriors from different tribes to serve under him. Tatars, Naimans, even former enemies. He didn't demand they renounce their heritage, only that they follow the rules. This wasn't how the Mongol world worked. But Temüjin was quietly rewriting the rules, one arrow at a time, and beneath it all he carried the same thought he had once whispered in the dark, chained to a collar. What kind of world could be built where power didn't vanish overnight? That question followed him through every cold morning and every cracked hoof, and as more and more tents gathered under his leadership, the answer began to take shape, not as a dream, but as a system, a new way of holding the steppe together, without birthright, without old grudges, without theft passed off as tradition. But could that system survive the first real test of war? Temüjin was no longer a whisper in the wind. His camp had grown, not just in numbers, but in structure. He issued commands with clarity, and his word began to shape behaviour. For the first time, tribes that once measured power in ancestral names were watching a leader whose authority came from action alone. He was not yet Khan, but his influence had begun to pulse like a drumbeat through the steppe. And then came the split. Jamuka, once the closest thing Temüjin had to a brother, now saw his friend's reforms not as innovation, but as heresy. The old aristocrats rallied behind Jamuka. The traditionalists, the noble bloodlines, the ones who saw Temüjin's rise as a challenge to their inherited order. They mocked his egalitarianism, whispered that he was lifting slaves and herders above their place, that his camp was a collection of orphans, widows, and castaways. Temüjin didn't argue, he simply prepared. By 1187 the tension broke into battle. The two former allies, raised under the same sky, who had once hunted marmots and shared salted milk, stood across from one another on the banks of the Onon River. Temüjin's army was smaller but more tightly disciplined. Jamuka's forces were larger, composed of many noble houses, each protecting their own interests more than any shared cause. At first, Temüjin pushed back his enemies. His warriors moved as one, organised by tens, hundreds, thousands, structured with clarity. But Jamuka's forces, though less disciplined, were overwhelming in number. Eventually the tide turned. Temüjin was forced to retreat. The defeat was brutal. Jamuka did not offer clemency. He captured 70 young officers from Temüjin's army, those he considered traitors to the aristocracy, and executed them by boiling. Not with blades or arrows, but with fire and time. It was not merely punishment, it was a message. Temüjin did not respond in kind. He withdrew quietly, regrouping not with vengeance but with patience. He studied where things had broken. He listened more. He restructured command roles, solidified reward systems, and began gathering more defectors, disillusioned warriors, mistreated servants, forgotten smiths. He welcomed them not as tools but as people. He remembered their names. Over the next several years, Temüjin laid low. He did not try to claim revenge. Instead, he focused on healing his small state. He brokered small alliances with the Uyghurs. He negotiated grazing access with the northern tribes. He even started training scribes, not for poetry, but for records, administration. This was new. For generations, Mongol leadership had been nomadic, fluid, and largely oral. But Temüjin understood that conquest without memory was useless. He wanted records. He wanted accountability. Slowly, his rivals began to notice something strange. His camps were quieter, more orderly. Raiding had reduced. Theft within his ranks was punished swiftly. And yet morale was higher. Horses were healthier. Trade was more frequent. Something was changing. Then, in 1201, a council of traditional Mongol leaders crowned Jamuka as Gurkhan, the universal ruler. It was a calculated move to unify the nobles under one banner, to push Temüjin into irrelevance once and for all. But it backfired. Many of the smaller tribes, those who had been neglected by aristocrats, those who had tasted Temüjin's justice, saw in this crowning a desperate grasp at old power. One by one, they began turning away from Jamuka, swearing allegiance instead to Temüjin. By 1206, after several skirmishes, defeats, exiles and betrayals, a new Kurultai, a tribal council, was called near the Onon River. This time, the council did not crown a Gurkhan from noble lines. This time, it raised Temüjin as Genghis Khan, a title meaning something like universal ruler, but with a deeper meaning tied to power earned, not inherited. It was not just a title change, it was a transformation of the entire Mongol identity. Temüjin, now Genghis, abolished the old tribal hierarchies. He reorganized society into decimal units. 10 households formed a unit, 10 units formed a company, and so on. Men from different tribes were placed together. Allegiance was no longer to clan but to command. He outlawed the kidnapping of women, standardized the script across the empire, and implemented tax systems. He formalized the law, yasa, a combination of oral tradition and codified rules, covering everything from murder to military discipline to livestock theft. In the world of the steppe, this was not only new, it was revolutionary, but Genghis Khan's story was only beginning. From a boy scraping roots from frozen ground to a prisoner in a wooden yoke, from a leader who once lost his wife to raiders to a man crowned by those who had once shunned him, he had built a state from ashes. Not through miracles, but through endurance, intelligence, and an unshakable belief in order where chaos had always ruled. The world would soon come to know the name Genghis Khan with fear, awe, and confusion. But before the sieges, before the Silk Roads opened, before the dust of empire choked the deserts from China to the Caspian, there was only one question in his mind. If I could rise from nothing, how far could I go before the world tried to tear me down again? And what kind of world could be built not for me, but for those like me, who had always been forgotten? Before he ruled with iron law and lightning raids, Temüjin was still only a name whispered in fear or reverence, depending on who was listening. The man who would later be called Genghis Khan did not always ride in front. Once he was led in chains, trapped not by strangers, but by his own kin. Before empires rise, they often fall in secret. And Temüjin's capture by the Taichi Oud was one of those quiet falls, one that almost erased him before the world had even learned his name. It began with scarcity. The steppe was never generous, and the winter before his capture had been especially harsh. Grass was brittle, flocks had thinned, and entire clans whispered about omens in the stars. Temujin's own band, still a loose gathering of loyalists and hungry dreamers, had fractured under pressure. There was no throne, only a shared fire and the aching hope that the next sunrise would bring something more than survival. In this brittle moment, the Taichi-ud clan, distant relatives by blood but political rivals by ambition, saw an opportunity. They had never accepted Temujin's quiet rise. Though his father, Yesugei, had once commanded influence among them, Temujin was a reminder of a bloodline they believed had overstayed its welcome. His unorthodox alliances with outcasts and common herders threatened the balance of tradition. He blurred lines they had worked hard to keep. When they offered a false alliance, a gathering to talk of cooperation and grazing rights, Temujin agreed, not out of trust, but necessity. He knew the dangers, but a leader without resources must sometimes walk into the lion's den if it means feeding his people. The Taichi-ud did not hesitate. No sooner had he dismounted than he was seized. Ropes, shackles, a cart with a cracked axle, the wood still sticky with pitch, became his prison. He was not beaten, not interrogated, just bound, humiliated not with violence, but with silence. His captors believed the worst punishment for Temujin was to vanish, to fade, to be reduced to nothing until his name was forgotten even by the herders who once followed him. For days he was kept under guard, his hands bound behind his back, his legs tethered to a post like a common thief. And in that time, something peculiar happened. He listened. Not to whispers or war plans, but to the rhythms of daily life within the Taichi-ud camp. He noted who gave orders, who hesitated, who was obeyed with respect, and who was tolerated out of fear. He watched how supplies were handled, how messages were delivered. Even in captivity he was learning, and among those watching him was a boy named Sorkan Shira, a low-ranking servant within the Taichi-ud, whose sons served as guards. He noticed the quiet in Temujin's gaze, not submission, but stillness, the kind of silence that hides fire. Over time, Sorkan Shira's family began speaking of the prisoner with something that was not pity but curiosity. Why had he been taken? Why was he so still? Why did the guards rotate more frequently around him than any other captive? And one night, with no orders, no prompting, Sorkan Shira acted. He sent his sons to loosen the ropes, not fully, just enough for circulation to return. Days later, under the cover of a distant thunderstorm, they returned again, this time with food and a plan. They cut the bonds and helped Temujin flee into the shadows, using the storm to mask their tracks. Temujin did not forget that act. Years later, when he ruled across nations, Sorkan Shira and his sons were given titles and land, remembered not because they were noble, but because they were just, because they chose righteousness over convenience in a world where few did. Temujin's escape was more than just an act of survival. It was a lesson that not all Mongols followed tribal lines blindly, that within the enemy's camp loyalty could still be born, that the power of influence was sometimes greater than the force of arms. When he returned to his scattered followers, many assumed he would seek immediate revenge, but Temujin instead did something unusual. He waited. He allowed the Taichi-ud to believe he was still weakened, still gathering. He fed their overconfidence, and while they settled back into routine, he prepared. The broken cart had not only carried his body, it had forced him to reevaluate the world he hoped to build. He had once believed that kinship would protect him, that blood ties, even strained ones, would slow the knife. But betrayal had come not from foreigners or invaders, but from those who spoke his language, who shared his ancestors, who had once broken bread in the same tents. He realized then, loyalty must be earned, not inherited. A tribe built on blood would eventually spill it, but a tribe built on trust and shared burden could endure anything. As Temujin rode again, still bruised but no longer bound, he asked himself, if even kin can betray, then what kind of brotherhood is worth building at all? Temujin's escape from the Taichi-ud camp had not left him free in the way freedom is often imagined. His wrists still bore marks from the ropes, and his mind carried deeper wounds, less visible but far more instructive. In the days that followed his return, he said little. He spent his time mending broken tools, speaking to no one about the betrayal. Not yet. He understood something now. Vengeance born in haste only feeds cycles, but vengeance sharpened by silence can cut cleanly. Those who welcomed him back noticed the change. He no longer spoke in the tone of a man clinging to bloodlines or inheritance. His words were colder, clearer, even when spoken softly. He asked questions he hadn't asked before, not who are your ancestors, but what have you endured, and whom do you serve when no one watches? These were not the inquiries of a tribal leader. They were the questions of a man trying to redraw what it meant to belong. Temüjin began shaping his camp differently. There were no promotions based on ancestry, no privileges for older names. Instead, merit, discipline, and loyalty became the only currencies. And within this quiet restructuring, he began gathering men and women who had known betrayal, not as legend, but as experience. Broken herders, displaced warriors, widowed mothers, abandoned sons. His camp was a tapestry of the forgotten, but when woven together, it held strong. He never spoke of the cart again, but its presence lingered. Every camp he built was organized, watchful, with guards rotated in silence and scouts trained to read not just tracks, but moods. He refused to let familiarity blind his defenses again. The pain had shaped him, not into paranoia, but into precision. The Taichi-ud, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had happened. In their minds, the escape of a single prisoner was a footnote. They still held the ear of certain tribes, still marched under the old banners of inherited authority. But they hadn't noticed what Temüjin had taken with him. Not supplies, not secrets, but their structure, their weaknesses. He had studied them from the inside. One by one, over the next 2 seasons, Temüjin began to undercut them, not with direct assault, but with offers. He sent emissaries to smaller clans under Taichi-ud rule, offering fairer grazing terms, protection from raids, even marriage alliances. He promised nothing grand, just consistency, the kind of leadership that didn't vanish when the skies darkened. And they listened. Because what the Taichi-ud had failed to understand was that power on the steppe did not belong to the loudest. It belonged to the one who could listen when no one else would. And Temüjin, for all his fury, was a listener first, but retribution would still come. When the time was right, when enough support had been quietly gathered, Temüjin launched a strike. It wasn't a war, not in the traditional sense. It was swift, calculated. He didn't burn everything. He didn't slaughter indiscriminately. He targeted only what had sustained their dominance. Storage sites, key riders, bridges of alliance. He dismantled the skeleton of the Taichi-ud's power without having to break its bones. Many of their warriors surrendered, others scattered. The chieftains who once held him captive were captured themselves. But Temüjin did not boil them, nor flay them, nor display them in cages. He offered them life, but not rank. Their punishment was not death, but obscurity. They were stripped of their titles and allowed to live among the people they once ruled, nameless. That, perhaps, was the cruelest mercy Temüjin could have offered. In the aftermath, he established an iron principle. No man shall be punished for the actions of his ancestors, nor rewarded for them. A revolutionary doctrine in a society still carved by genealogy, but the people understood its power because they had seen what he'd endured. The broken cart once used to humiliate now lived on only in memory, and even there it had transformed. It had become a symbol, not of weakness, but of the hinge in Temüjin's life when he stopped seeking acceptance within the old world and started building a new one. A world where laws came before names, where suffering wasn't shameful but qualifying, where the measure of a man wasn't his lineage, but how he bore the weight of being forgotten. And so Temüjin's army grew, not because he promised glory, but because he proved that even those chained and left behind could stand again and lead. But still, beneath the new rules, the quiet organization, the swelling ranks, one memory remained. If they chained me once, who else among us has been shackled and never found their way back? In the long shadow of the cart he once sat bound beneath, Temüjin now stood among warriors who followed him not because of his name, but because of what that name had endured. The Taichi-ud had tried to erase him, but instead they had created something far more enduring than fear. A leader who saw weakness as a blueprint, not a flaw. And in this clarity, Temüjin reshaped everything that had once failed him. With his enemies subdued, he did not rest. Instead, he turned his focus inward, towards structure, towards law. In most tribes, decisions had always been made through age-old customs, shifting loyalties, and oral oaths. Temüjin disrupted this pattern with a calm boldness. He began codifying behavior: theft of livestock, a specific penalty, desertion in battle, a fixed consequence, mistreatment of women or enslavement of surrendered foes, prohibited by decree. This wasn't idealism, it was survival. An army made from many tribes could only last if bound by more than fear. The remnants of the Temüjin who submitted found themselves absorbed, not into chains but into ranks. They were given roles, not titles, horses, not banners. Temüjin understood something older than conquest, that dignity, once returned, creates loyalty deeper than command. He also began to erase the boundaries between peoples. Men who once would not eat from the same pot now drilled together under the same sun. Those who had never spoken across tribal lines now stood shoulder to shoulder under a new banner, not of the Borjigin, but of the empire in waiting. It was in this slow, deliberate cohesion that Temüjin's vision took shape, not as a dream of revenge, but as an architecture of resilience. What the Temüjin had intended as a breaking point had instead become his moment of unification. He had walked through their betrayal and emerged not wounded, but redefined. And though many of his followers had never seen the wooden yoke, they spoke of it like scripture. He wore the kang, and still he rose, they whispered at night, around fires that burned across the plains. The story grew, not in embellishment, but in reverence, because they all knew what it meant to be silenced, sidelined, shackled. Temüjin had carried their collective shame and turned it into purpose. From this moment onward, his campaigns would be more than military. They were moral in the eyes of those who followed. He wasn't just building an empire, he was avenging every forgotten man who had once been told to wait his turn. Temüjin's legacy, of course, would come to include sieges, walls shattered by siege engines, cities turned to ash, and the trembling of kingdoms who heard the hoofbeats long before the arrows arrived. But those grand stories, those violent years, would always be built atop the soil of this one quiet humiliation. The broken cart never appeared in any banner. No poem was written about it, and yet it shaped the structure of a world that would reach from Korea to the Caspian, because in that cart a boy once realized the truth that would follow him to his death. True strength is not the ability to break your enemy, but the power to stand when the world has already buried you. And as Temüjin rode out years later toward greater wars and darker glories, he did not look back on the Temüjin with hatred. He remembered them as the final lesson he needed, that even among your own, chains can find your wrists, but it is the one who breaks them, quietly and without hatred, who earns the right to lead a broken world. Before Temüjin was ever a Khan, before his name stirred fear in empires, he was a young man with nothing. No herds, no allies, no safety. And yet, even then, there was one thing he still had. A promise. Not a throne, not a sword, but a memory of a girl named Borte. She was not a symbol, not a pawn in a political game, but a quiet thread that ran through the core of his rise. If Temüjin built an empire of riders and fire, it was Borte who gave it its spine. Their union had been arranged, as most marriages were. Temüjin was barely 9 when his father, Yasuge, brought him to the Ongirat people to form a bond with their chief. The Ongirat, settled and pragmatic, agreed to give their daughter, Borte, in marriage. For Yasuge, it was a step towards strengthening ties. For Temüjin, it was a moment he hardly understood. A betrothal that seemed like a distant echo in a world where survival came first. And then Yasuge died. The family's position crumbled overnight. Temüjin's lineage meant nothing without force to defend it. The alliance with the Ongirat seemed like one of many things that might quietly dissolve in the winds of the steppe. And yet, years later, Temüjin returned to them. Not with glory, not with gold, but with resolve. He had no dowry worth naming, just a handful of men, a worn horse, and the belief that a promise was still a promise, even when the world had forgotten it. Borte accepted him without ceremony. Their marriage was simple, no feast, no procession, just firelight and quiet words. But in that union, something rare took root. In a world where alliances were fleeting and women were often used to seal fleeting treaties, Borte became more than a bride. She became his partner. She was intelligent, but not showy. Fierce, but never loud. She remembered the names of warriors Temüjin barely knew. She managed the movement of camps while he was away. She tended the fires and the grain, and she listened more than she spoke. Among the women she was respected not just as a wife, but as a pillar. Their time together was brief, at first. Not long after they were married, a band of merkits descended on Temüjin's camp. The merkits had old grudges with Yesugei's line and saw Temüjin's young marriage as a vulnerability. In the dead of night they raided the camp and stole Borte. Temüjin returned to ashes and emptiness. There was no body, no final word, just silence. And in that silence something in him changed. Not rage, but clarity. For all his years of exile and betrayal, this was different. He had lost many things before, his father, his tribe, his inheritance, but this was the first time something had been taken from him that he had chosen. He didn't act recklessly. Instead, he turned to a childhood bond that had not yet snapped, Jamuka, his blood brother and rising ally. And together, they moved with precision. The raid against the merkits was swift. Their camp, scattered across low hills, was not expecting retaliation so soon. The alliance Temüjin had gathered struck hard, reclaimed what had been taken, and burned only what needed to burn. Borte was recovered, alive, though changed. No one asked what she endured. She never spoke of it publicly, and Temüjin never forced the truth. What mattered to them both was that she returned, and that from that point on their bond was no longer political, it was iron. Shortly after her return, Borte gave birth to a son, Yokchi. There were whispers, quiet doubts about the child's parentage. The merkits had taken her for weeks. The lines between shame and speculation blurred in the gossip of other camps. Temüjin silenced the whispers not with violence, but with decision. He accepted Yoshi fully, raised him as his own, loved him without public hesitation, because Borte was his wife, and her truth was his law. This act was not just personal, it was political. In a society where honour was often defined by appearances, Temüjin chose loyalty over reputation, and in doing so, he built a foundation for his empire that no sword could shatter. Trust rooted not in convenience, but in conviction. As his influence expanded, so did Borte's responsibilities. She was not a queen, not in name, but in function, she was. Everything an empire needed before it had a name. She managed winter stores. She mediated disputes between rival women. She organised travel routes for entire camps during migrations. She kept the hearth burning while the future Khan rode toward fire. Through all of this, she never demanded power. She shaped it. Years later, when Temüjin was crowned Genghis Khan, Borte stood beside him, not as a relic of his past, but as a co-architect of his rise. The soldiers remembered the raids. The elders remembered the bloodlines, but Borte remembered the hunger, the silence, the days before any of it meant anything. And perhaps that is what made her so irreplaceable, because in every campaign that followed, in every new banner raised and law declared, Temüjin knew that none of it would have stood without the woman who believed in him when there was nothing yet to believe in. But in those early days, just after the rescue, as they sat by the fire in silence, just two people rebuilding trust in the darkness, Temüjin must have wondered, if she had not returned, what kind of man would I have become? Borte did not speak often in public, but when she did, the camp listened. Not because her voice was loud, but because it was deliberate. She had a presence that came from quiet endurance, the kind of authority that builds in the dark when no one is watching. After her return from captivity, she did not retreat into sorrow. She picked up the daily rhythms of nomadic life with a poise that unsettled even her rivals. Temüjin, too, was different. He had always been a calculating leader, shaped by hardship and betrayal. But after Borte's abduction and recovery, he began moving with a new kind of urgency. It wasn't vengeance that pushed him. It was the need to create a world where what had happened to her would not happen again. Not to her, not to anyone under his protection. He restructured his alliances, not only by strength, but by trustworthiness. He paid closer attention to tribal customs involving marriage raids, abductions, and the bartering of women as property. While the broader Mongol world still accepted these practices as part of the order of things, Temüjin began quietly outlawing them in his ranks, not with sweeping proclamations, but with quiet warnings and decisive punishments. Men who took women by force were expelled, their names erased. He didn't preach virtue, he enforced accountability. At Borte's urging, the camp began to change as well. She introduced methods for storing grain, for managing wool during long migrations, for organising the herders' output based not on family ties, but on efficiency. It was practical, unremarkable to outsiders. But it kept the camp functioning through hard seasons, and gave Temüjin the freedom to wage war knowing his rear was not in disarray. She rarely travelled far from the heart of the camp, but her influence spread beyond tents and cauldrons. When ambassadors arrived from distant clans, Borte hosted them with precision. She remembered names, noted loyalties, kept track of promises made over fermented milk and dried cheese. Diplomats who underestimated her often found themselves answering questions far more insightful than they expected from a Hatun. She bore 4 sons, Yoshi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui, and ensured they were raised with more than just martial instruction. She pushed for stability in their upbringing, continuity in their caretakers, and order in their learning. This might seem mundane, but in the turbulence of Mongol life it was revolutionary. Sons of warriors were often raised amid chaos. Borte ensured hers were not. The tension between Jokchi and his brothers simmered quietly for years. While Temüjin publicly accepted Jokchi as his own, whispers of uncertainty remained. Chagatai, in particular, often questioned his older brother's right to lead. Borte never allowed herself to be pulled into their rivalry. She offered them all the same calm discipline, correcting them not with raised voice but with stillness. Her presence became the one constant they all shared, an anchor in a world of shifting loyalty. Outside of her family, Borte's leadership reached into circles that history rarely documents, those of women. The seamstresses, the foragers, the widows, the midwives. Under her, they were given a more structured voice within the camp. Not politically, but socially. Borte organised them into rotating responsibilities. Some would care for the elderly, others would oversee trade caravans. She built a network of responsibility and interdependence that survived even in the absence of formal institutions. Temüjin trusted her counsel in ways few men of his time would have allowed. She knew when to press and when to wait. She never interrupted war councils, but warriors noted that strategies often changed after Temüjin returned from a quiet evening by their fire. She was not flawless. There were moments when her judgments favoured familiar clans, times when her silence on internal disputes allowed resentment to grow. But these were the imperfections of someone building order in a world that had never known it. Not failures, but growing edges. Perhaps most striking was her ability to remain grounded. Even as her husband conquered cities and collected tribute from distant rulers, Borte never clothed herself in gold or moved into palaces. She continued to live in felt tents, managing the same tasks she had when they had nothing. Even foreign dignitaries who visited the Mongol encampments remarked on the simplicity of her quarters, organised, quiet, but never extravagant. She understood what many conquerors never did. The illusion of permanence is the first step toward collapse. Empires fall when their leaders forget what it felt like to have nothing. Temüjin, for all his thunder on the battlefield, never forgot Borte's early days beside him. How she steadied his resolve with a single glance, how she turned a cold tent into a command centre, how she survived her own form of captivity and returned unshaken. And in her quiet, steady presence, he found something he could never take by force: legitimacy. Because what good was empire if it could not keep the fire burning at home? Years passed. The felt tents multiplied into armies, and the horizon that once ended at the next ridge now stretched beyond the known world. Cities surrendered, Khans bent the knee. Languages Temüjin did not speak were now spoken in his name, but through the sweep of conquest and the roar of battle, one presence remained constant, not in front of the army but just behind it, beneath the quiet canopy of the central tent, Borte. She had never raised a sword, she never rode at the front lines, but the empire knew her, and perhaps more importantly, it moved the way it did because she had helped build its shape. While Genghis Khan expanded outward, Borte deepened the roots inward. She understood that an empire cannot survive on victories alone. It must survive the long winters, the unseen losses, the weight of feeding tens of thousands. She became the steward of everything that held the centre in place: the families, the herds, the traditions that preceded bloodshed, and would still need tending after the soldiers returned home. In Karakoram, the loose capital of what would become the Mongol Empire, she organised the distribution of tribute. Silk, spices, grain, gold, all passed through hands she quietly appointed. Her network was not made of generals or ministers, but trusted women who had served alongside her since before the first campaigns. They handled the sorting, recorded the quantities, ensured the winter supplies were not diverted. It was governance without spectacle. When foreign wives and princesses were brought into the fold as part of marriage treaties and conquests, Borte welcomed them with measured dignity. She ensured they were housed according to tradition, given responsibilities, and most importantly, made part of the system rather than held apart from it. She understood the quiet danger of resentment that brews in silence corners, and so she made space for the foreign and the unfamiliar, not out of sentiment, but strategy. Temüjin, now Genghis Khan, consulted her more often in these years than ever before. He did not ask her how to take a fortress, but he asked her what to do once it fell, what to do with the wives of fallen rulers, the merchants who survived a siege, the orphans left in the rubble. She rarely offered opinions in public, but in private, her counsels shaped the tone of how the empire managed peace. And still she remained rooted in the steppe. Even with foreign luxuries arriving in waves, she chose to live in the same felt structures she always had. She travelled with the camp. She milked mares with the older women. She stitched clothing during long rides. It wasn't humility, it was clarity. She knew that the strength of the Mongol way came not from opulence, but from motion, from simplicity, from adaptability. Her sons, grown now, began to wrestle for position. Yochi, still marked by questions of legitimacy, led successful campaigns in the west. Chagatai, blunt and law-bound, grew resentful. Ugadei, moderate and respected, became the quiet favourite. Borte did not intervene directly. She guided, reminded, and stepped back. She understood that empire could not be mothered. Still, it was clear that her voice shaped succession. When Temüjin grew older and began thinking of his legacy, he turned not to warlords or astrologers, but to Borte. And when she endorsed Ugadei as his successor, despite him not being the eldest, Temüjin's decision followed. Her influence did not end with her death. The administrative system she nurtured, the ones few ever wrote about, formed the foundation for how the Mongol Empire governed far beyond the battlefield. Tax structures, resource rotations, tribal integration, these were not the ideas of generals. They were shaped in the domestic spaces Borte curated. She passed quietly. No lavish tomb, no great monument. Only the reverence of those who understood where the real empire had lived. And even centuries later, when chroniclers wrote of Genghis Khan, when they described his brutality, his strategies, his vision, they rarely mentioned her in detail. But those who knew, the ones who traced the empire's arteries, not just its swords, understood that without her, it would have cracked from within long before it ever reached the sea. Borte's life was not marked by dramatic moments. No dramatic rebellion, no sudden elevation. But it was her slow, unbroken thread of presence that kept everything from unravelling. And in the final chapters of Temüjin's life, when the earth beneath his empire began to tremble with succession fears, famine and fatigue, he must have wondered, in the silence before sleep, if she had not believed in me when I was no one, would there be anything here at all? Before Genghis Khan ruled continents, before his banners crossed rivers and mountain chains, there was a long stretch of time that no one speaks about. These were the quiet years, when Temüjin had no title, no army, no land to his name. The years when he was not yet Khan, and few thought he ever would be. They were not marked by glory, but by slow movement. Whispers, bartered favours, and the constant weight of being overlooked. He was in his 20s. The glow of youth was gone, but the wrinkles of authority had not yet arrived. He had a wife, a few loyal riders, and a reputation that shifted depending on who was asked. To some, he was a stubborn herder with grand ambitions. To others, a threat to the fragile alliances that kept the Mongol steppes from falling into endless blood feuds. But to most, he was simply forgettable. A man born of a dead chief, surviving off memories and grudges. During these years, Temüjin travelled often, not in conquest, but in negotiation. He moved from one tribe to the next, sometimes to ask for help, sometimes to offer it. He brought small gifts, felt, wool, salted meat, and asked for grazing rights or temporary passage. Sometimes he was welcomed, sometimes turned away. He kept no formal court, no written alliances, only promises, recalled in memory, trusted to be remembered. He built relationships, not in courts or councils, but beside fires, over long rides, in whispered conversations between scouts. He promised fairness where others demanded loyalty. He swore that those who followed him would not be forgotten, even if they fell nameless in battle. It was a strange pitch in a world where glory came from bloodline and display. But some listened. In these years he began collecting men who had no place elsewhere. Broken sons, banished cousins, servants tired of silent mistreatment. What Temüjin offered was not wealth. He had none. Not power. He barely held his own camp together. What he gave was dignity, a place, a cause. Among these followers were men who would later be remembered as legends. Borchu, the quiet herdsman who once returned a stolen horse to Temüjin before ever swearing allegiance. Jelme, the healer who would one day save Temüjin's life on the battlefield. Subutai, still just a boy, herding goats in the hills, unaware that one day he would command armies across continents. But back then, they were only names whispered around fires. No songs had been written yet. Temüjin spent these years refining his sense of order. When disagreements arose in his camp, he listened first. He refused to allow disputes to fester. He created small courts, not grand, just structured meetings where arguments were heard and decisions made. This was rare. Most tribal disputes were settled with fists, or ignored until they exploded into raids. Temüjin offered something different: process. He insisted on discipline, even in the smallest things. Horses were to be watered at certain intervals. Tools were shared, not hoarded. If someone took more than their fair share of meat, they were corrected, not shamed, but reminded. Over time, these small habits built something larger than anyone realized: a culture. Yet still, no tribe recognized him as a Khan. Others around him claimed the title freely. Jamuka, his childhood blood brother turned rival, had already been crowned Gur Khan by a coalition of nobles. The Taichiud still held their ceremonies. The Naiman and Keret clans maintained their own lines of succession, their own claimed rulers, their own legitimacy. Temüjin had none of it. But he watched. He took note of how power worked, how decisions were made in large clans. He saw how chiefs were often chosen for name, not wisdom. How favoritism hollowed out loyalty. How titles given too early weakened leadership. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that true command is not claimed. It is granted slowly by those who choose to follow without being forced. So he waited. In this waiting, he began gathering something that other Khans overlooked: trust. While they collected warriors by bribes or threats, Temüjin created a chain of loyalty that had been earned by years of shared hunger, mutual labour, and remembered kindness. When a follower lost a horse, Temüjin sent his own. When a child grew sick, he sat beside the fire and listened. These were not the acts of a Khan, but they were the acts of someone building something deeper. He also began laying the groundwork for something else: mobility. He studied routes, built small caches of food and supplies across regions. He made sure that if his camp ever needed to move quickly, it could. His people were trained not just to fight, but to pack swiftly, to adapt, to live lean. He knew that the time would come when slow movement meant death. And so, while the rest of the steppes danced in cycles of feasting and fighting, Temüjin moved in quiet arcs, learning, adjusting, building a network not of banners, but of belief. At night, when the winds rose and the tents creaked in the dark, some of his followers would ask, "When will we be strong enough to answer them?" And he would say, "Little." He didn't promise revenge, only this: the storm waits for no one. But the ground it floods must be ready to hold it. He wasn't Khan, not yet. But the silence around him was growing heavy with direction. The years that followed saw no great battles, no epic victories to carve into memory. Temüjin still rode as an outsider, present at councils but never central, invited to feasts but seated near the margins. He spoke only when necessary, observed more than he acted. This too was strategy. In a world full of men eager to be seen, he had learned the value of patience. He continued building, not cities, not armies, but patterns. Patterns in how his camp moved, how it solved disputes, how it shared responsibility. These quiet systems became habits, then expectations, then identity. His followers began calling him Egesin, not as a title, but as a recognition. The one who keeps things in balance. It wasn't royal, but it carried weight, because people trusted him not to rule with privilege, but to settle storms. In a culture long steeped in feuds and fractured loyalties, this kind of leader was unfamiliar, neither tyrant nor appeaser, just steady. Temüjin's power, if it could be called that, was not territorial. He had no permanent base, no fortified stronghold. But his camp had a gravitational pull. Over time, displaced herders, outcast soldiers, even tired scouts from rival clans began drifting toward him. Some stayed quietly, doing work, asking no favours. Others came seeking judgment. Having committed wrongs their own tribes refused to forgive, he gave them rules, nothing more. But the fact that they came to him at all meant something was shifting. One bitter spring, a minor famine struck parts of the steppe. While larger clans struggled to feed their bloated followings, Temüjin's camp endured. Not because they had more, because they had less, but managed it better. Their supplies had been quietly stored. Their herds rotated on predictable cycles. They had learned to stretch, to share, to anticipate. Other camps began noticing. Whispers spread. They never go hungry, some said. They waste nothing, said others. These weren't compliments. They were warnings. The old guard began seeing in Temüjin's camp a threat, not of swords, but of structure. His rise wasn't dramatic. It was efficient. That terrified them more. Still, he claimed no khanship. Even when asked, he deflected. "I am no one's Khan," he would say, "only a man who tries to do right by those who stand with him." This humility wasn't feigned. It was tactical. He knew that the steppe would turn on anyone who moved too quickly. Claiming titles before earning them only made a man easier to cut down. During this time, a key moment unfolded, one that would quietly define the future. The Jin dynasty, south of the steppe, had begun manipulating Mongol tribes, offering bribes, gifts, and vague promises in exchange for border loyalty. Some tribes accepted, others hesitated. Temüjin refused outright. He understood something most did not, that an empire offering gold today might demand blood tomorrow. Instead, he sent a small message. "We take nothing we cannot repay." It was not a boast. It was a boundary. And the Jin didn't respond. They didn't need to. Temüjin's name was not yet significant enough to stir concern, but his refusal caught the attention of nearby leaders. Some, like Togrul of the Kherate, began to watch Temüjin more closely. Togrul was aging and childless, a once great leader now isolated by his own weakening clan. He remembered Yesugei, Temüjin's father, and the old alliances they had shared. In a moment of cautious generosity, he offered his protection to Temüjin, calling him a son by oath. This gesture changed everything. With Togrul's name behind him, Temüjin could now attend councils as more than just a tolerated guest. He could speak as a man backed by an elder. For the first time, he stood without apology. He did not use this new power to punish. He used it to formalize. He proposed new rules for hunting, how game should be divided, how long the chase should last, what rights belonged to the chaser, and the one who delivered the final blow. It seemed petty to some, but these rules settled dozens of old disputes. He proposed marriage arrangements not based solely on rank, but also on proven character. He began allowing skilled warriors from outside his kin to marry into his inner circle, blurring tribal lines. These weren't just reforms. They were rehearsals for something larger. All the while, his personal discipline remained exact. He woke before dawn, inspected animals, asked questions about storage, reviewed camp disputes. He did not delegate what he hadn't first done himself. His authority came not from declarations, but from habits others could see. One evening, under a sky swollen with stars, a young scout asked him directly, "When will they call you Khan?" Temüjin stirred the fire slowly and replied, "When they stop asking why I deserve it." It was not humility. It was design. Because he knew the winds of the steppe were changing, and when they shifted fully, it would not be because he forced them. It would be because, when they arrived, they found him already standing where the storm would hit. The years wore on like stretched hide, quiet, tough, and patient. Temüjin's following was no longer a wandering group of dispossessed herders. It had matured into a mobile machine of discipline, fairness, and resolve. Still, no coronation had marked his rise. No grand feast had crowned him Khan. But among those who followed him, there was no longer any question who led. He had begun restructuring Mongol society long before anyone noticed. It started with a decimal organisation. 10 households made a unit, 10 units made a company, and so on. This system not only blurred tribal lines, but diluted the grip of noble families who had ruled through ancestry. It was a meritocracy concealed within a military framework, and its genius was in its invisibility. No speeches, no manifestos, just function. With each passing season, more men came to his camp with grievances against their own chiefs. They weren't revolutionaries, they were tired. Tired of being overlooked, underfed, and sacrificed for the honour of men who had never held a bow in war. Temüjin welcomed them not with promises of plunder, but with rules, predictable, consistent, hard, but fair. And in a land of shifting alliances, that consistency was more valuable than gold. The moment when this all crystallised wasn't marked by battle. It came during a famine. The Karit, the tribe of his oath-father Togrul, faced a disastrous spring. Their herds had dwindled. Internal disputes fractured their cohesion. Rival claimants circled like wolves. Temüjin, who had long stood in Togrul's shadow diplomatically, now offered aid, not out of ambition, but obligation. He sent supplies, men, and messengers, who carried not threats but structure. In that crisis, the Karets saw what Temüjin's camp had become. Not a roaming war band, but a society. It was then that his authority stopped being questioned. Not declared, simply accepted. Soon after, a Kurultai was called, not by Temüjin, but by his followers. It wasn't a lavish affair. No silks, no emissaries from distant kingdoms. Just the steppe, the wind, and the gathering of men who had watched him for years. How he settled disputes, how he punished cruelty, how he buried his own without fanfare. They lifted him up not with crowns or relics, but with words and recognition. They called him Khan, not Genghis yet. That would come later with empire, but this was the first breath of it, a title given by a people who had seen every side of him, flawed, scarred, measured, and decided he was the best chance they had. His first act as Khan was not war. It was law. He issued a declaration that all children born to slave women were to be treated equally to those of free wives. This stunned the elders, but to Temüjin it was simple justice. How could he claim to unite the tribes while allowing inequality in the heart of his own camp? He forbade the kidnapping of women, an ancient tradition once accepted as courtship by force. He outlawed betrayal between blood brothers, established compensation rules for theft, and formalised systems for distributing loot evenly after battle. These weren't just laws, they were an outline of the society he meant to build, stable, flexible, loyal to principle, not pedigree. And in the midst of all this structure he remained unchanged in habit. He still rode out to inspect grazing lands, still ate the same fermented mare's milk, still wore the same heavy deal stitched by his wife. Power had not changed his rituals, only his reach. News of his consolidation spread. Some rival clans mocked him, others panicked. They began forming uneasy alliances, desperate combinations of names and resources, hoping to stop a storm that still looked, on the surface, like a breeze. What they didn't understand was that the storm had already passed through Temüjin's camp. It had come in the form of hunger, betrayal, and years of being ignored, and what had remained after the storm was a force that could not be unlearned. He was no longer the boy begging for allies, nor the fugitive escaping from wooden stocks, nor the forgotten husband reclaiming a stolen bride. He was still all of those things, but now they stood behind him like shields, not burdens. In the stillness after the Kurultai, when the horses were tethered and the stars stretched clear across the plains, one of his oldest warriors, Bo-Chu, sat beside him and asked, "Do you feel like a Khan now?" Temüjin didn't look up from the fire. He replied, "No. I feel like the same man. Only now they finally see what I always carried. It wasn't the title that changed him. It was the years when no one believed, and he kept going anyway. Long before Temüjin became Genghis Khan of battle and conquest, he fought a different kind of war, one with no arrows, no sieges, and no blood spilled. It was a war of persuasion, of slow negotiations, of respect paid in silence, and it was in this quiet campaign that he achieved what no other Mongol leader before him had managed, unifying rival tribes not through force, but through alignment. The steppes were vast, but never empty. Dozens of tribes scattered across the plains had their own customs, dialects, grievances, and rivalries. The Naiman, the Taichiud, the Karait, the Ongirat, the Tatar, the Merkit, all with histories knotted in raids, marriages, revenge killings, and shifting oaths. To bring them together had long been considered impossible. Most who tried were either killed, absorbed, or forgotten, but Temüjin had studied their ways. He knew that most alliances in the steppe were built like smoke, rising fast, fading faster. What he sought was something different. Not temporary unity, but structure. Not domination, but reorganization. His first method was subtle. He offered predictability. Other Khans promised glory. Temüjin promised grazing routes, food in winter, security during migration. He didn't need to bribe chiefs. He offered them stability, which, in a world of endless risk, was rarer than gold. He visited their camps not as a conqueror, but as a guest. He did not speak over their elders. He asked questions about their trade routes, about how they punished theft, about their grievances with neighbours, and he listened, really listened. He understood that for a people long ignored by powerful clans, being heard was the first step toward loyalty. And he didn't just listen, he adapted. If a tribe had a better system for rotating pastures, he adopted it. If they tracked seasonal rainfall more accurately, he incorporated it into his planning. He never claimed ownership over their wisdom. He credited them publicly, honouring their knowledge. This wasn't diplomacy, it was integration. One by one, smaller clans and minor houses began aligning with him, not because he overpowered them, but because he didn't erase them. The second key to his unification was something deceptively simple: discipline. Other leaders allowed favoritism, corruption, and petty revenge to flourish beneath the surface of their rule. Temüjin didn't. He enforced laws among his own people even when it hurt. If a man from his camp stole from a guest, he was punished immediately. If an officer disrespected a tribal elder from another group, he was removed. There were no exceptions. This shocked many. It also earned trust. As more tribes joined his orbit, he refused to fold them into his own clan. Instead, he gave them places within his decimal system, organizing them into units based on ability, not origin. This erased centuries of infighting. A Tatar might fight beside a Naiman. A former enemy might lead a patrol with a former rival. By separating identity from function, Temüjin diluted old grudges without ever forbidding memory. He used marriage as another tool, but not as a weapon. He did not demand brides as tribute. Instead, he offered his daughters in marriage to other tribal leaders, then elevated those in-laws into meaningful positions. These weren't ceremonial unions, they were mutual investments, and once those bonds were formed, he kept his word. A lesser-known innovation came in the form of mouth inspections. Yes, the teeth. Before assigning a soldier to a unit, Temüjin would have his officials inspect their teeth, jaw, and gums. At first, this seemed odd, even invasive, but to Temüjin, it was logical. A soldier with bad teeth couldn't eat well, couldn't ride long, couldn't survive winter marches. He didn't care what tribe they came from. If they couldn't survive the grind of the steppe, they couldn't serve in the vanguard. The practice became symbolic, proof that ability, not ancestry, defined worth in his camp. And for many tribes who had spent generations ranked by bloodline, this simple test felt oddly liberating. Through these quiet reforms and policies, a new system emerged, not just a confederation but an organism. It moved together, fed together, punished together, and all without open war between the core tribes. There were tensions, of course. Elders resisted change. Traditionalists scoffed at Temüjin's merging of identities. Some feared losing their clan's uniqueness, but he didn't force conformity. He allowed cultural rituals to continue, as long as they didn't conflict with the greater law. This balance, between shared structure and tribal autonomy, was what made his system work. It wasn't unity by erasure, it was unity by function. By the time Temüjin was ready to face external enemies, his internal world was already aligned. The tribes under his leadership didn't just follow, they belonged. They shared purpose. No blood had been drawn between them to make it happen. Only time, order, respect, and teeth, inspected quietly, one soldier at a time. And so, without ever drawing a sword between them, the once warring Mongol tribes moved under a single banner. Not because they had to, but because finally someone had given them a reason to. Temüjin understood something few leaders of his time even considered, that real unity is not declared, it is lived. After organizing the tribal world into decimal units and weaving together families with careful marriage diplomacy, he took the most dangerous step of all. He began dismantling the idea of fixed loyalty to one's birth clan. In Mongol tradition, loyalty to tribe came before loyalty to Khan. A man would die for his family, but not always for a flag. Temüjin knew this instinct ran deep. He also knew that it would destroy any hope of lasting cohesion, and so he began replacing kin-based hierarchies with rank, based on merit and obedience. He issued a directive that no military unit could consist entirely of one clan. Commanders were forbidden from leading their own relatives. Horsemen were rotated through duties with strangers. Trust would be built not from blood, but from shared hardship. There were murmurs at first, objections whispered after nightfall, but as campaigns expanded and raids became longer, the logic became clear. These mixed units were more resilient, more adaptable, less prone to fracture under pressure. He formalized a rule: the spoils of war would be divided evenly, not by status. In previous systems, commanders and nobles often claimed the largest share. Temüjin ended this. Loot was to be distributed by need and performance. A whole low-born archer who had risked his life would receive the same as a general who gave the order. This wasn't generosity, it was discipline. It told every man, from goat herder to horse captain, that the system respected him, so long as he followed its laws, and in return he demanded something rare for a Mongol warlord: obedience not to a person, but to the law itself. Temüjin's yasa, a code of conduct both legal and moral, began circulating in oral form. It was memorized, repeated, and enforced. It forbade theft among allies. It punished cowardice. It outlawed false testimony and disobedience during hunts or battles. It wasn't democratic. It was strict. But its fairness was unmistakable. For the first time in generations, men could predict the consequences of their actions in any tribe aligned with Temüjin. He also introduced something new to the steppe: accountability across rank. If a soldier under a commander broke the law, the commander shared the punishment. This terrified officers, but it also forced them to monitor their men, train them better, care about their discipline. Leadership became a responsibility, not a reward. With this framework in place, Temüjin could do something previously unthinkable. He could move entire tribes as if they were limbs of a single body. When spring migrations came, hundreds of yurts would shift together, not in confusion, but in rhythm. When news of an enemy reached his scouts, he could send out commands and be sure they would be obeyed, not questioned. All of this had been done without launching a war of conquest against the inner steppe, but Temüjin was not finished. He realized that while structures could hold people together, identity kept them rooted, and so he found a way to give identity back to his new army, not through flags, but through story. He commissioned his scribes, not many, just a few, to begin preserving oral histories. Each unit was encouraged to remember its own heroes, victories, and origin tales, but now these stories were framed within the larger story of the unity they served. Thus, a man from the Tatar line could tell his son not just of his ancestors' raid, but of how their family had fought beside a Naiman brother in the defense of the southern river crossing. Stories, braided together. Legends, rewritten not in ink, but in firelight and memory. This did something that laws alone could not. It made men proud not just of their clan, but of the structure that held them together. In these years, there were no campaigns westward, no sieges of Chinese fortresses, no foreign enemies defeated, and yet this was perhaps Temüjin's most important campaign. The unification of men who had no reason to trust one another. One commander described it years later simply: "We no longer remembered who we were before." only that now we ride together. And perhaps that was the genius. Temüjin hadn't erased difference. He had given it purpose. He had not asked men to forget their blood, but to pour it into something greater. And all of this, somehow, had been done without forcing a single loyal tribe to submit at sword point. Not a drop of blood shed between his followers to create this order. No forced oaths, no raised camps, only time, structure, and a leader who had once been broken and had no desire to break others. But now, with this unity solidified, the question began to rise. What would this machine do when pointed outward, toward those who had never listened, never offered friendship, and never expected the Mongols to rise? By the time Temüjin's banner fluttered across the steppes with steady recognition, there had still been no major battle among his own. His greatest conquest, perhaps, had gone unnoticed by the outside world. While other Khans sharpened swords and mapped raids, he had been doing something far more dangerous, removing the very roots of chaos from within the Mongol heartland. His leadership had not risen through a blaze of battlefield glory. It had crystallized in the daily grind, in food distribution, in fair rulings, in marriages that weren't taken by force but sealed by mutual respect. This was not the kind of power chroniclers like to write about. It did not dazzle, it endured. The tribes were now no longer scattered in purpose. Under Temüjin, they began to think of themselves less as fragments and more as a force. There was no single term for what they were becoming, no word in the steppe languages for a nation, but that's what it was in essence, a nation born not from land, but from law, order, and shared experience. Temüjin didn't waste time proclaiming what had already become clear. He never declared unity, he just kept moving, south, east, across rivers and forests, toward enemies who had never expected the scattered tribes to breathe as one. Before setting his sights on the Jin dynasty or Khwarizm, he knew he had to test his new structure, not with foreign blood, but with internal strain. And so he deliberately created controlled pressure. He challenged his own ranks with logistical experiments, moving whole units across difficult terrain, coordinating winter retreats, rotating command during minor raids to test leadership in different tribes. These were not glamorous, but they revealed who cracked and who adapted. He took note of every failure, not to punish, but to correct. If a unit commander failed to share rations evenly, he was demoted. If a camp left behind injured warriors during a migration, they were relocated to a less critical post. Corrections came swiftly, but without spectacle. Temüjin believed that public shame made men bitter. Quiet discipline made them better. Meanwhile, tribal elders who had once distrusted his system began to shift their view. At first, they had joined him out of necessity, poor harvests, rival pressures, hopes of protection. But now they stayed because the world Temüjin had built worked. Disputes were resolved before blood spilled. Orphans were assigned guardians, widows received livestock shares, trade moved across former battle lines. The Mongol world, long accustomed to collapse and rebirth, was now simply stable. And stability for nomads was its own kind of revolution. In these years, Temüjin's inner circle became not just loyal, but legendary. Men like Subutai, Jebe and Gelme, who had once been nameless riders, now led entire divisions. Their talent was not in family heritage, but in understanding the new way of thinking, flexible, organized, and absolutely devoted to the Yasa. One of the most significant decisions Temüjin made during this period was establishing the Keshig, a personal guard, not just bodyguards, but a living symbol of the trust he placed in structure. They were drawn from all tribes, rotated daily, and subject to the same laws as every other warrior. If one failed his duty, the entire shift was held accountable, and yet it was an honor to serve. Because even proximity to Temüjin was a lesson. He used the Keshig to test new systems before expanding them, rotating patrols, guard duty schedules, communication signals. It became a model for what the rest of the army would adopt. Efficiency was prized, but so was clarity. Orders could be memorized and relayed quickly, and every man knew his role. This was not the erratic, passionate fury of old tribal warfare. It was method. And it was only now, after all this groundwork had been laid, that Temüjin began to prepare for external war. The steppe was no longer fractured. It was an arrow, drawn and aimed. What came next would not be a series of raids. It would be campaigns, coordinated, planned, synchronized in a way no steppe force had ever achieved. But what made this possible wasn't the weapons, or even the riders. It was the fact that they trusted one another, that Tatars no longer feared betrayal from Kerets, that Naimans no longer questioned their right to command on Girit's scouts. They had trained together, eaten together, buried their dead beside one another. Temüjin had taken a land defined by rivalry and suspicion, and turned it into a living force, and it had all happened slowly, without war. Later historians would try to explain how he had done it, how the man who came from nothing rose to command the steppe. They would write about battles and tactics, about sieges and horses, but they would miss this quieter truth, that long before the cities burned, long before the rivers ran red, Genghis Khan had already won the war that mattered most, the war against the chaos within. And as he looked out over the united camps, now pulsing like a single organism beneath the wide Mongol sky, he must have wondered, what happens when the world sees what this order can do, when pointed not at ourselves, but outward? Before the Mongol Empire thundered across continents, before thrones were toppled and cities fell beneath iron hooves, there was a river, quiet, winding, half forgotten. The Onon. It did not roar, it whispered. And along its banks, under shade and silence, Temüjin held the first meetings that would change the shape of the world. This was not where power was usually decided. Most alliances among Mongol nobility were forged in loud feasts, amid meat-laden tables and competitive toasts. There, strength was displayed like a contest. But Temüjin, still early in his rise, chose differently. He invited no drums, no banners, no wide-eyed spectators. Only the men he trusted most, summoned one by one under the pretext of hunting, resting, or trading. The Onon was neutral ground. Its waters touched many tribes, but belonged to none. That made it perfect. And in a time when tribal loyalties were fragile and betrayal only a glance away, Temüjin knew the best plans weren't shouted. They were spoken just above the rustle of river grass. He met with Boorchu first, his oldest companion, a man who had once returned a stolen horse to a poor, unknown boy, and in doing so had bound himself to history. Their conversation was short. Temüjin laid out his vision in fragments: unity beyond blood, a new structure beyond inheritance, discipline across tribe. Boorchu listened. He didn't speak much, but when he nodded, it wasn't just agreement, it was confirmation. Then came Gelme, the healer turned warrior, a man who had once dragged Temüjin from the battlefield, bleeding and barely breathing, refusing to abandon him even as arrows flew overhead. Gelme was skeptical, not of the plan, but of others. He had seen how easily men turned for a sack of meat or a bride. "They'll nod now," he warned, "but they'll turn when the hills change colour." Temüjin didn't argue. He only replied, "Then we build something stronger than weather." Over days the gatherings grew. Subutai arrived, still young, but already brilliant in thought. Kasar, Temüjin's own brother, impulsive, loyal, easily provoked. The discussions were never formal. They happened between bites of dried cheese, while sharpening blades, or as smoke drifted from cooking fires. But they were constant. Temüjin didn't preach. He asked questions. What breaks a man's loyalty? What makes a soldier fight when there's nothing left to take? What law survives when memory fails? Each man gave a different answer, and Temüjin took them all, like scattered bones, and began to form a skeleton of the future. They spoke not of battles, but of administration, of how to gather information from distant scouts, how to ensure messages could be passed between camps without distortion, how to punish corruption without stoking rebellion, how to manage justice across tribes that spoke different dialects and followed different totems. The most pressing issue was succession. Even at this early stage, Temüjin knew that leadership often died with the leader. The steppes had seen too many Khans fall, only for their sons to fight, like wolves over the scraps. He proposed something revolutionary, not choosing heirs by age, but by character and capability. The others were stunned. In a society where birth had long been destiny, this was sacrilege. But Temüjin pressed on. An empire made from merit, he said, will survive the death of the man who dreamed it. Some were hesitant. Kasa, in particular, resisted. Blood binds, he argued. If we forget that, we'll become rootless. Temüjin listened, then replied, Roots rot in soil that's never turned. It was around the third night that a decision was made. Not written, not declared, but understood. These men, bonded by more than past loyalty, would become the core. Not just generals, but stewards of a vision. They would enforce the laws Temüjin had not yet written. They would shape the future long before the world knew it was coming. They began assigning roles. Orchu would oversee logistics, supplies, trade, camp movement. Gelmi would serve as the inner guard's captain, ensuring that even Temüjin himself was bound by the same codes as his men. Subutai, the youngest, would train messengers and begin mapping out efficient routes across the steppes. Kasar would manage the raw fighters, instilling discipline in those who had only ever known chaos. None of these men wore rank. They had no medals, but their authority grew because it functioned, and others noticed. By the time news of these meetings reached rival tribes, it was already too late to unravel what had been sown. This wasn't a faction. It was a machine beginning to hum. Tribes sent scouts, pretending to trade salt and livestock, but what they reported back was always the same. Temüjin's camp is quiet, but tight. Too tight. And so, the Onon River remained still, bearing no witness to banners or blood. Only the echo of plans carried on smoke and wind. Temüjin's great empire had not yet fought a war, but it had already begun choosing its shape, not with force, but with thought. And as he looked across the river, watching the reflection of his fire flicker on the surface, he must have asked himself, if we can hold the centre this steady in peace, how far can we stretch it in war? As spring bled into summer, and the Onon's waters thickened with silt and reflection, Temüjin's informal council no longer met in secret. It didn't need to. The silence they had once used for protection had become strategy. Now they spoke openly, around shared fires, before curious onlookers, amid the chores of daily life. Their meetings became part of the rhythm of the camp, but their content remained precise, intentional, and always several steps ahead of what anyone suspected. The question now was no longer if a campaign would come, but when and how to prepare a structure that would not collapse beneath its own weight once the battles began. Temüjin's closest circle had shifted from conversation to construction. What began as whispers by the riverbank was now being implemented across his entire camp. They created protocols, not grand decrees, but clear, enforceable customs. Scouts were now given detailed reporting methods. Messages were timed, routes tested. Each man in the camp, no matter his origin, knew his role during migration, during conflict, during supply shortages. No one was left unsure. These procedures weren't just for the sake of order. They were designed to create something far more powerful: self-sufficiency. Temüjin wanted a system that didn't crumble when he was absent. He wanted lieutenants who could lead entire operations without needing his direct instruction. This wasn't delegation. It was decentralization born from necessity. Orchu oversaw the testing of chain-of-command drills. He ran scenarios where leaders were removed mid-march, and junior officers had to step up instantly. Success wasn't measured in victory, but in continuity. Could the camp move without confusion? Could supplies flow? Could horses be rotated, fires managed, water located? They found weaknesses. They corrected them. Meanwhile, Subutai, young but now hardened, worked on cartography. Not in parchment maps, few could read them, but in memory-based networks. Riders were taught landmarks, river bends, how long it took to ride between points under different conditions. He developed what later historians would call a mental web of the Mongol world. By the time Subutai was finished, every key courier in the network could visualize hundreds of miles of territory without ever seeing a scroll. Kasa, rough and straightforward, developed new training routines for younger warriors, not to fight, but to endure. He'd watched too many tribal skirmishes won by strong men who could not survive a second winter. So he drilled the recruits on sleeping wet, riding hungry, fighting uphill and keeping horses alive during dust storms. When questioned why he was so brutal, he simply said, "Anyone can kill. We need men who can keep moving after." Gelme, ever the protector, focused on internal security. He established watches, not just for the perimeter but within. He knew that stability didn't break from the outside first. It decayed from betrayal, from jealousy, from whispered doubt. His guards didn't just patrol, they listened. They prevented conflicts before they began, resolved tension with a word before it became a knife. And Temüjin, always watching, always listening, began shaping something subtler than law: identity. He knew that even with structure, discipline, and leadership, unity could falter if the people didn't feel part of something greater. So he started crafting a language, not literal, but cultural. He spoke often about Turul, kinship by spirit, not blood. He elevated loyalty to the whole above loyalty to origin. And when he rewarded men, he didn't say, "You have served me well." He said, "You've strengthened what we're building." And what they were building was no longer a coalition of tribes. It was a force that could survive death, dislocation, even defeat, because it wasn't tied to land or faces, it was tied to function. Word of this growing system reached the ears of other tribal khans. Some dismissed it, others grew nervous. Whispers circled that Temüjin was not just gathering men, but changing them, making them into something unnatural. "They obey without question," one rival muttered, "like ants crawling in step." Another responded, "No, they move like they know what comes next." That was the threat. Not Temüjin's numbers, not his charisma, but his preparedness. The river had done its part. It had given them a quiet place to imagine. But now the imagining was over. Soon the first real test would arrive, not in a grand campaign, but in a betrayal. Togrul, the Karet Khan, who had once called Temüjin a son, began to grow jealous. His own position had weakened, while Temüjin's had risen quietly behind him. Couriers who once rode for Togrul now took routes designed by Subutai. Younger warriors now requested to serve under Boorchu's banner. Respect, like water, was shifting course. Temüjin saw it coming. He didn't panic. He didn't lash out. He simply met again by the river, with the same men, under the same trees, and asked, "If he turns, are we ready to hold the centre?" The answers did not come as oaths. They came in nods, in silent calculations, in the certainty that the groundwork had been laid, not in weeks, but in seasons. The river, once still, now moved more quickly, pulling twigs and leaves in quiet spirals. Change was coming, but this time they would not be caught by it. Temüjin had never trusted comfort. He understood too well that quiet often signalled what would not last. And though the Onon River still flowed undisturbed, and his camp moved in silent harmony, he felt it. The tension in the air before the first splintering crack. Togrul, the aging Khan of the Karait and once a father in oath to Temüjin, had begun unravelling. Not in rage, but in caution. He had ruled for decades by relying on tribal balance, equal parts favour, force and fear. But now, the wind had shifted. The strength he once offered Temüjin had reversed. His name no longer commanded awe. His sons fought among themselves and his riders whispered admiration for the younger man whose laws ran deeper than blood. Temüjin had never moved against him. He still honoured the bond, still called him Khan, but others were watching, and among them was Sengum, Togrul's son, ambitious, insecure and hungry to protect his father's waning relevance. Sengum saw Temüjin not as a partner, but as a shadow overtaking the light. He pushed his father to act. "If you wait," he warned, "you will not be sharing power with Temüjin. You will be kneeling to him." Togrul hesitated. He had seen Temüjin's loyalty firsthand. He had welcomed him in the lean years, had trusted him when others did not, but fear has a strange way of turning memory into suspicion. And so, at Sengum's urging, he made a choice. Without warning, a message was sent to one of Temüjin's outer camps, a demand: withdraw from Keret lands, disband your units, dissolve your council. It was not phrased as war, but it was a provocation, a test. Temüjin received the message while on the banks of the Onon. He read it once, set it aside, and did not speak for hours. Then quietly he summoned the same men who had first gathered under the willow branches. He did not raise his voice. He did not speak of betrayal or insult. He simply said, "The time for rehearsal is over. Now we find out if the machine we built can hold when something breaks." Orders were dispatched by nightfall, not for full-scale war, for movement, precise, intentional. Camps were to consolidate. Scouts were to monitor Keret patterns, not engage. Supply lines were reinforced. Routes that Subutai had mapped seasons earlier were finally used. There was no panic, only action, and that was the difference. Togrul's camp, once stable, now swirled with uncertainty. Sengum's ambition had fractured loyalties. Some of Togrul's commanders hesitated. unsure if they were marching against an enemy or an old ally. Temüjin's name still meant something in their ranks. Temüjin, for his part, still did not strike. He sent a final letter, hand-carried by Gelmi himself. It asked no favour. It simply reminded Togrul of the oaths once spoken and warned of what division would bring. "We built something beside the river," it read, "not with spears but with trust. If you undo it, the pieces will not fit the same again." Togrul never responded. Within a week, minor skirmishes began on the border. Nothing coordinated, just riders testing edges. But Temujin's camp absorbed them like a wall of windbreakers. They were too organised, too trained. There was no break in their movement. When it became clear that confrontation could not be avoided, Temüjin did not deliver a declaration of war. He simply moved. Not with haste, but with certainty. And in the minds of those who watched, it became clear. This was no longer the Temüjin who once rode alone, asking for allies with calloused hands and tired horses. This was a leader whose army moved with quiet precision, whose orders were understood before they were spoken, whose strength came not from numbers, but from cohesion. Togrul's position collapsed faster than anyone expected, not because his forces were weak, but because they no longer trusted each other. His lieutenants questioned Sengum's intentions. Some defected mid-campaign. Others simply vanished into the steppe. Temüjin, as always, did not gloat. He spared those who surrendered. He absorbed their families into his structure. He offered positions to those who submitted early. The war ended before it had truly begun. But the damage was not just to Togrul. It marked a turning point in Temüjin's journey. Until now, his consolidation of power had been clean, earned through negotiation, structure, and shared purpose. This was the first break, the first time he had to move against someone he once honoured. And though the victory was total, something shifted in him. That night, as his men gathered again by the Onon, not in secret but openly in celebration, Temüjin stood slightly apart. The river still whispered its slow song. He watched it carefully, because he knew, even rivers that nourish can one day flood. And so he asked himself, not aloud, but in the hollow of his thoughts, if this was the cost of stability, what would the cost of empire be? Temüjin had won without wanting to. The collapse of Togrul's house wasn't a triumph, it was a warning. The steppe was too fragile to be held together by names, oaths, or sentiment. In the aftermath of that fracture, as his camp grew swollen with new followers, defeated enemies, and drifting families, Temüjin stood at a crossroads not of geography, but of governance. Power had come. That was no longer in question. But what would keep it from collapsing under its own weight? He knew the answer would not lie in conquest. Swords won territory. But order was slower. It had to be built like a yurt, pole by pole, tightened with bone and softened with silk. And so, in the wake of his quiet victory, Temüjin began laying the foundation of something the steppe had never known. A legal code not bound to tribe, not dictated by momentary rage or family vengeance, but fixed. He called it the Yasa. No scrolls survive. No official version was etched in stone. And yet, its impact moved through the Mongol world like breath through a lung. It was not a law in the imperial sense. It was a system of behaviours, consequences, rituals and boundaries, collected, memorised and repeated. Its form was oral, its effect iron. The first laws were practical. No stealing from fellow soldiers, no hoarding supplies, no violence between brothers in arms. It wasn't morality, it was functionality. Temüjin understood that a fractured camp couldn't march. An army that fought itself had already lost. But quickly, the Yasa grew deeper. It touched marriage, inheritance, hunting rights, military organisation and diplomacy, execution for desertion, banishment for rape, a system of tax, of rotation, of responsibility. And unlike the laws of the old clans, it applied to everyone, from servant to general, from commander to Khan, even to Temüjin. That was the difference. There had been laws before, but always twisted by power. A noble could strike a herdsman with impunity. A favoured son could take more than his share. But under Temüjin's code, the law sat above every man. It could not be bent by rank. And when he punished his own kin for crimes, the message was unmistakable. No one is greater than the structure that holds us. He began using record keepers, men trained not to write, but to remember. These Rakachi would sit in councils, listen to rulings, and then recite them later, word for word. They were living scrolls, trained in rhythm, breath, cadence. Their loyalty was not to any tribe, but to memory. Some tribes resisted. The idea that tradition could be replaced by system felt cold. One chieftain of the Jadaran clan asked, "Who will teach our sons to fear the old ways if the new ways forget the blood?" Temüjin replied only, "The blood is still here, but now it runs in a straight line." He created a specific rule forbidding nobles from taking livestock or labour from the poor, without just compensation. This enraged the elite, but it won him the loyalty of thousands of low-born riders, those who had once hidden their daughters during visits from rich khans, who had feared every footstep outside their tents. He even established protection for travellers and messengers. A man bearing the Khan's arrow could pass through any camp without fear. If harmed, the punishment was swift and merciless. This allowed him to spread commands across vast distances with confidence, knowing that law itself guarded his words. Another core element of the Yasa was intertribal harmony. Temüjin forbade blood feuds between formerly rival clans. If a dispute arose, it would be brought before his appointed arbiters. No more cycles of revenge that dragged on for generations. "We ride as one now," he told his council, "and a wound in one hand will rot the whole body." Temüjin knew that the strength of the Mongols did not lie in numbers or weapons, but in motion, and motion could only be maintained if everyone understood where the boundaries lay, and yet the Yasa was not inflexible. Temüjin allowed for adaptation. He revised laws when they no longer served function. When famine struck a distant camp and food theft increased, he amended the rule. Theft during starvation would not be punished by death, but by restitution after the crisis ended. Law without mercy, he realized, was just another kind of tyranny. Women too found space under his code. Borta and other senior wives were given power to arbitrate disputes within the domestic sphere. Widows inherited livestock. Women could divorce under specific conditions. It was not equality as understood today, but it was radical on the steppe. What grew from this legal foundation was not peace in the romantic sense. It was stability. A system where warriors knew what was expected, where punishment was not guesswork, where leaders could be held accountable, and where no man could hide behind lineage when the law was broken. Years later, when his empire spread across thousands of miles, the Yasa would still be cited by generals, remembered by scouts, and feared by criminals. Its roots lay not in conquest, but here, in these early days, when Temüjin chose not to bask in power, but to restrain it, because he had seen what happened when Khans ruled only for themselves. He had served under men whose moods shaped law. He had watched justice traded like livestock. He would not be that kind of ruler. As the structure took shape, one of his men asked, "What if a great man breaks the law?" Temüjin didn't hesitate. Then he was never great. The more his authority grew, the more Temüjin leaned on the law, not because he feared losing power, but because he feared what unchecked power would do to the very thing he had built. He had seen too many rulers fall, not from the blade of an enemy, but from their own indulgence. The Yasa, his evolving code of conduct, was not his shield. It was his leash, a reminder that even the Khan must bow to the world he'd created. It was during the first campaign against the Tatars that the true weight of the law was tested. A group of Tatar prisoners had been taken after a successful ambush, among them women, children, and elders. In the old way, they would have been slaughtered without question. Vengeance for Temüjin's father, who had been poisoned by Tatar hands decades before, still echoed through the ranks. His men expected blood. Instead, Temüjin convened a trial. He questioned each prisoner. Who had ordered the attack? Who had brewed the poisoned drink? Who knew? And who obeyed? It took days. His soldiers grew restless. But when the guilty were identified, only they were executed. The rest was spared. This was not mercy. This was message. He was telling his army, and the world beyond, vengeance is no longer law. Some commanders resented it. They whispered that Temüjin had gone soft, but those whispers faded when they realized what the law protected wasn't enemies. It was them. If law could restrain vengeance against hated foes, it could also protect a poor soldier from a powerful lord's anger. That balance became sacred. Temüjin enforced it with brutal consistency. When one of his own generals, trusted, proven and feared, took grain from a poor herder during a winter march, Temüjin summoned him before the council. No defence was offered, no favouritism applied. The general was stripped of a rank, his horses redistributed, and he was made to publicly apologise to the herder before the entire camp. That night, no songs were sung, but the wind carried a new kind of trust. His followers began calling the Asa the silent harness. It was invisible, but every man felt its pull. In times of hunger, it kept camps from descending into theft. In moments of confusion, it brought consistency. And in war, it ensured that even when blood was spilled, discipline remained untouched. A less visible, but equally important part of the code was its handling of oaths. In the Mongol world, promises were not made lightly, but they were also often forgotten when inconvenient. Temüjin changed that. Under the Yasa, a broken oath, whether to a comrade or to the Khan, was treated with the same severity as theft. He believed that loyalty must extend beyond battlefield courage. It must live in memory, in word, in follow-through. To reinforce this, he did something radical. He made himself accountable to his men. In one incident, a scouting party returned with intelligence Temüjin had disregarded. Acting against their report, he launched an assault on a smaller enemy camp and nearly lost a supply convoy because of it. Though the campaign still succeeded, he stood before the command circle that evening and admitted fault. "I broke the code," he said, "by placing my impulse above our structure. That is not how we lead." There was no punishment, but the act itself spoke volumes. A Khan who held himself accountable did not need to punish others into obedience. His restraint was a deeper kind of authority. As the law matured, it adapted to empire. Temüjin introduced taxation not as tribute, but as structured contribution. Every 100 households were required to provide a set amount of horses, grain, or labour annually. But in return they received protection, access to trade routes, and the right to appeal to Mongol law, even against outsiders. For the first time, nomadic communities operated under a system of civic inclusion. Disputes between tribes, which once led to generational blood feuds, now passed through judges, appointed not by tribal loyalty, but by skill and fairness. These men were trained not only in Mongol customs, but in the Yasa's evolving precedents. A judicial culture was taking root, not in parchment halls, but in saddle and soil. Temüjin knew this was fragile. That law could fade if not reinforced with living example. And so he created festivals, not for celebration, but for reaffirmation. During Naadam, warriors demonstrated skill, but laws were read aloud as well. Public cases were reviewed, misdeeds judged. It reminded the people, the law is not a weapon, it is a spine. We do not ride without it. Some visiting traders and diplomats were baffled. How could a leader so feared, so capable of levelling cities, choose to be so bound? But they missed the point. Temüjin didn't obey the law because he had to. He obeyed it because without it, his empire was just another camp with better weapons. And as he rode out from a council one evening, after punishing a cousin for mistreating a farmer, after refusing a gift from a noble seeking favour, after enforcing the law against a man who had once saved his life, one thought stayed with him. Let them say I was cruel, but never say I was lawless. As the Mongol Confederation transformed into something greater than anyone had imagined, it was not the clash of hooves nor the fire of conquest that held it together. It was the invisible structure Temüjin had etched into the rhythm of every camp. The Yasa was no longer just a code. It had become the nervous system of a living, breathing empire. By now, dozens of tribes, clans, and newly subdued peoples had been absorbed into his domain. From the wandering forest dwellers of the north to the trading towns along the Silk Road, all now lived under one canopy. And while many had bowed reluctantly to Mongol power, what surprised them most was not the discipline of the warriors, but the stability of the law. Merchants who once bribed their way past corrupt checkpoints in other lands now found Mongol routes safer than any guarded gate. If they displayed the girij, the metal tablet stamped with the Khan's emblem, they could ride unharmed for days, even weeks, across territory where no empire had ever dared promise protection. It was the Yasa, not swords, that guaranteed this. And so, the bones of empire were reinforced by rules, while the silk that connected distant parts was trust. But this system was not self-sustaining. It required constant tending. Temüjin appointed darugachi, governors, tax collectors, enforcers of the law across the newly joined regions. They were chosen not by birth, but by ability. Some were illiterate, others former slaves, even one was a foreign artisan who had proven capable of managing a caravan route under extreme pressure. What mattered was reliability. They were instructed not to dominate, but to stabilize. When the first reports of abuse surfaced, one darugachi hoarding livestock, another demanding favors from local craftsmen, Temüjin acted swiftly. He summoned both to the capital, stripped them of titles in front of a public audience, and had their property returned to the communities they had wronged. His messengers then travelled the length of the land, not to boast of his strength, but to declare, the law protects the weak, even from the appointed. Such enforcement spread fear among corrupt officials, but faith among common people, and it was this faith, more than fear, that made the Mongol system unlike any nomadic confederation before. Temüjin had once built loyalty through shared hunger and hardship. Now he was reinforcing it with predictability. Even conquered territories found something unexpected. Where they expected pillage, they found inspections. Where they expected slavery, they found census takers. Soldiers escorted grain to villages left weakened by earlier conflicts. Orphans were adopted by units who shared no language with them, and tax policies, though firm, were calibrated to local capacity, not blind extraction. Still, the Yasa was not static. Each year, Temüjin summoned his closest advisors to review how the laws had functioned. He listened not just to generals, but to herders, translators, caravan leaders, women from noble lines and widow shelters. If a rule no longer served its purpose, it was reworded. If a loophole had allowed suffering, it was closed. The law, like the land, had to be reshaped by season. One day, an envoy from a distant kingdom asked him how the Mongol Empire expected to endure without temples, palaces, or stone walls. Temüjin replied simply, "We build not with stone, but with memory, not with mortar, but with law." Even within his own family, the law remained supreme. When a dispute arose between his sons, Chagatai and Joshi, whose rivalry simmered beneath every council, Temüjin did not hide it. He summoned witnesses, clarified inheritance, and issued a ruling that balanced tradition with order. Yoki's position, long questioned because of his birth during Borte's captivity, was reaffirmed, not by affection, but by precedent. He knew this would anger Chagatai. He accepted it. Better a son's anger, he said, than an empire's fracture. And still, Temüjin understood the weight of the system he'd created. He had shaped a world where his name could no longer excuse injustice, where his own decisions could be questioned, not by challengers, but by the very code he had summoned into being. He once told Gelme during a cold evening by the fire, "I am not building for myself. I am building for a day when no one remembers my face, but still follows my law." That vision was already unfolding. In towns where Temüjin had never set foot, men still invoked the Yasa in disputes. In markets, deals were sealed not with threats, but with shared rules. Riders passed each other in the night, not as strangers, but as bound companions under an unseen covenant. What Temüjin had created was more than dominance. It was discipline disguised as culture. It was empire, not in architecture, but in behaviour. And as he looked out over the endless plains, no palaces, no statues, just wind and tents, and the quiet rhythm of a people finally breathing together, he knew the sword had built his name, but the law would carry it farther than he ever could. Before the Mongol Empire had yet stretched across continents, before the thundering hooves reached the gates of Europe or the shores of the Levant, there was one moment that changed everything. It began not with a grand declaration or a bloody conquest, but with silence, a stillness just beyond the familiar grasslands. It was the edge of Mongol memory, a land of walls and kings, foreign scripts and hidden cities. The name was whispered through caravan tongues, Xia, Western Xia. The Xia kingdom was a different world. Unlike the scattered clans of the steppes, the Xia had built stone cities, cultivated fields with irrigation, written laws in multiple scripts, and governed with bureaucracy. They were an offshoot of the Tanguts, an ethnic group that blended Chinese administrative thought with Tibetan and nomadic traditions. Their land spanned the desert fringes of northern China, from the Ordos loop of the Yellow River to the edges of the Gobi. It was a kingdom that had, for a time, balanced its position between the powerful Song to the south and the Jin dynasty to the east. But for Temüjin, who was now Genghis Khan, the Jia represented something new. He had unified the Mongol tribes. He had written law into flesh and memory. Now he had to test whether this machine of order and loyalty could operate beyond the world that knew his name. Could warriors who once only fought to protect pasture lands now ride into cities whose language they did not speak, whose customs they did not share, and still hold together? His decision to invade was not born of hunger nor revenge. It was strategic. The Western Xia sat astride the caravan roads of Central Asia. If the Mongols were to evolve from a nomadic coalition into a true imperial force, they would need access, not only to grain and metal, but to the ideas that flowed through trade. Their weapons had been born in the steppe, but their future would be written on the walls of foreign capitals. He began by gathering knowledge. Before any blade was drawn, Genghis sent scouts disguised as merchants. He interrogated returning traders. He learned of the fortified city of Yinchuan, the Xia capital, with its thick mud brick walls and network of canals. He learned of their war elephants, beasts imported from the south and armoured for battle. He noted their reliance on city-based supply and their unfamiliarity with high-speed mobile warfare. Then he waited. Genghis Khan did not march blindly. The Yasa demanded preparation. In the year 1205, he sent a smaller expedition, a probing raid to test their defences. The force returned battered but live, carrying maps, estimates, and reports. More importantly, they brought fear. For the first time, the rulers of Western Xia heard of a new storm brewing in the steppes. When the full invasion began in 1209, it moved like a breath held for too long. The Mongols did not strike the capital directly. Instead, they moved like water around stone, targeting border forts, cutting trade routes, intercepting messengers. Genghis believed that siege was not about walls, but about isolation. A city without allies is already dying. Temüjin had mastered horse archery long ago, but now he began mastering siegecraft. His army brought with it Chinese engineers taken from earlier raids into Jin lands. These men showed the Mongols how to build traction trebuchets, how to divert rivers, how to undermine walls with fire and salt. What the Xia had built over generations, Genghis aimed to unmake in months. But Yinchuan would not fall easily. The city was well defended. The Xia emperor refused to surrender, and the canals surrounding the capital made direct attack nearly impossible. So Genghis changed the terrain. In a move that would become legend, he ordered his men to divert the Yellow River, a massive hydraulic undertaking never attempted in steppe warfare. Their plan was to flood Yinchuan from beneath, turning its canals into death traps. The scale of it defied belief. Dikes were built by hand, the river's flow manipulated over weeks of labour. Soldiers became labourers. The law of conquest had shifted into the engineering of destruction, and yet the plan backfired. The diverted waters overflowed unpredictably, drowning portions of the Mongol camp instead. Horses were lost, tents swept away, supplies ruined. The lesson was bitter. Not every force in the world bowed to Mongol will. Still, Genghis would not retreat. He encircled the city, starving it, bombarding it, refusing negotiation until a message arrived from within, emissaries bearing a symbol of surrender. The Xia emperor offered tribute, camels, grain, weapons, and a royal daughter for marriage. Genghis accepted, not out of weakness, but calculation. This was not submission. It was a delay, a foothold, a lesson. He had not conquered the Xia fully, not yet. But he had entered the world beyond the steppe. He had shaken the gates of walled civilizations. He had sent a message not only to Xia, but to the other kingdoms watching from a distance. We are coming. We do not need your roads. We will build our own. And now he had a new question. If this was the edge of the known world for the Mongols, then what lay beyond the walls of Xia? What cities still whispered false security behind their ramparts? The surrender of Western Xia in 1209 was not an end. It was a pause. Genghis Khan accepted their tribute, took their princess, and rode away without seizing the capital. Many thought the storm had passed. The Xia emperor believed his offerings had secured peace. But Temüjin never viewed temporary submission as lasting loyalty. To him, peace without submission was just delay, and every delay had its cost. The Mongols returned to the steppe, not weakened but wiser. The flooding of their own camps during the siege had taught them that nature was not their servant, and that the cities they would face next would be even more complex. Temüjin saw that brute force alone could not conquer the urban world. To expand the Mongol domain into civilization's heartlands, they would need engineers, translators, logisticians, and something far rarer: patience. For the next few years, Genghis Khan trained his forces not just in war, but in administration. He sent envoys and spies along the trade routes to understand the politics of other kingdoms. He allowed Shia to believe the tribute had satisfied him. But inside Mongol camps, blacksmiths were forging siege weapons, scouts were mapping desert roads, and messages were being relayed across thousands of kilometers. It was during this pause that Temüjin began redefining the Mongol army, not only as a tool of conquest, but as a system capable of transforming what it touched. He assigned permanent ranks to commanders. He ordered written inventories of supply animals and wagons. Communication between distant units was standardized, with signals, flags, and courier stations. The Mongol army became a machine that could adapt to any terrain, any population, any threat. And then he turned back to Western Xia. In 1219, after years of expansion into Central Asia and the dramatic conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis Khan's gaze returned to his earlier opponent. The Xia had betrayed him. During his campaigns in the west, they had refused to send troops in support. They had broken their promise. For Genghis, this was not just insult, it was defiance. He sent a single warning. There was no reply. What followed was not a campaign, but an extermination. This time, Genghis did not come to negotiate, and he did not accept tribute. His armies moved with terrifying efficiency, surrounding towns, demanding surrender, and executing resistors to the last. Cities that once proudly defied him now found themselves erased from maps. Yinchuan, the capital that had once resisted the river, was besieged again. This time without floodwaters, without mercy. Temüjin's engineers had learned from their earlier failure. Instead of attempting to break nature, they worked alongside it, drying trenches, undermining walls, cutting off canals. They didn't try to drown the city. They let it rot from within. It was during this second siege that Genghis gave one of his most ruthless orders, that the entire Xia royal line be annihilated. No bloodline, no future heirs, no shrine or tombstone left to bear the memory of resistance. The Tangut language, unique to the Xia and once used in imperial records, began to vanish. Entire libraries were burned, sculptures defaced, cities repopulated with Mongol settlers and allied tribes. The Western Xia were not simply conquered, they were erased. But why such extreme vengeance? Some historians argue it was symbolic. Temüjin had promised loyalty would bring security. Xia had tested this promise, and so he answered, not with emotion, but with principle. If even the memory of betrayal was allowed to survive, what message would that send to the Jin, the Song, the distant powers watching nervously from Persia or India? Others say it was strategic. Genghis had begun to sense the burden of distance. Every new conquest stretched his army's supply lines thinner. He didn't want to revisit past territories again and again. To eliminate resistance permanently, he had to remove the possibility of future rebellion. And yet the Xia's destruction carried a quieter legacy. Among the ruins, Mongol scribes found Tangut manuscripts, strange boxy characters unknown to them. Linguists were assigned to decode them. Some documents contained information on irrigation systems, metallurgy, and Buddhist cosmology. Genghis ordered that useful knowledge be preserved and absorbed into his growing administrative system. His empire would not just absorb territory, but technology. Later, one of his generals remarked that the emperor had not merely conquered Xia, but harvested it. As for the survivors, a few Xia nobles fled to the Song dynasty. Others were absorbed into Mongol auxiliary forces. A few Tangut craftsmen lived out their years rebuilding walls they once defended, and the princess, Genghis Khan's royal consort, given in tribute years earlier, remained a silent reminder. Though her kingdom had vanished, she was still honoured in the Khan's camp. No one ever recorded her name, but she was said to have walked the quiet places between tents, never speaking of her homeland, never asking why it had been lost. For Temüjin, The conquest of Xia confirmed something deeper than military success. He now knew that an empire was not built by the sword alone, but by memory. Memory of what happens when trust is broken. Memory of who kept their word and who did not. And the world was watching. Would the Jin be next? Or would Genghis find the next battle not in China, but in the shadows of the Silk Road? When the last wall of Yinchuan finally cracked beneath the relentless weight of Mongol iron and patience, a silence followed, not one of peace, but of extinguished breath. There were no songs sung for the fallen kings of Xia, no bell tolled across the desert, no procession of monks to light incense for lost emperors. What remained was dust, and in that dust the quiet certainty that the Mongol Empire had taken its first true step into the world of cities and crowns. But conquest does not end when the final soldier leaves the field. It lingers, in the ruins, in the rewritten maps, in the dreams of those who watched it unfold and whispered warnings in marketplaces 1,000 miles away. The story of Western Xia became a cautionary tale, not only for the courts of the Jin or the halls of the Song, but for the distant rulers of Persia, Khwarezm, and beyond. Temüjin, now secure in his identity as Genghis Khan, took no pride in the annihilation, at least none that history records. What mattered was precedent. The seer had taught him that mercy without control was illusion, that peace could not be maintained on oaths alone, that if the empire were to last, its memory had to be carved into the bones of geography. Yet, from the ashes of Western Xia came unexpected gifts. Among the prisoners taken were engineers who understood desert terrain in ways no Mongol had considered, how sand shifted beneath wheels, how wind shaped the dunes. Their knowledge would later aid Mongol invasions into the Muslim world. From the looted libraries came texts on astrology, medicine, and the translation of Buddhist sutras. These were not treated as sacred, but useful, stored, copied, and sometimes adapted. In Genghis Khan's mobile court, a new class of scribes emerged, men who could read Chinese, Persian, Uyghur, and Tangut. He did not want stories of victory written in only one tongue. He wanted a language empire, one that could speak to every border at once. What he had taken with fire, he would govern with script. But most important was the shift in identity. After Xia, the Mongols no longer saw themselves as just steppe people. They began to see themselves as inheritors of failed civilizations. They could ride through deserts and scale mountains. They could adapt siege engines and absorb foreign craftsmen. They could punish betrayal with silence and elevate loyalty with law. They were not merely warriors now. They were the architects of a new world order, one that ignored walls and replaced thrones with saddles. And yet, the ghosts of Xia were never far. In the following years, as Genghis Khan turned his attention westward, to the Khwarezmian Empire, to the lands of the Caliph, to the empires of India and the shadowed cities of Europe, there were always whispers. Whispers that what had happened in Yinchuan could happen anywhere, that no city was safe, that even memory could be erased. The Mongols never again committed an act of cultural erasure quite as total as what they did to the Xia. Some scholars believe Genghis regretted it. Others argue it was a singular warning, so effective that no other kingdom dared force him to repeat it. And yet, centuries later, when archaeologists would one day dig beneath the sands of modern Ningxia, they would find shattered pottery etched in Tangut script, fragments of stone reliefs bearing Buddhist imagery, bits of armour melted by fire, and in the corner of one collapsed temple, a child's wooden toy, half burned and buried in silt. The Xia had not vanished entirely. They had become something else, a lesson, a shadow on the edge of empire, a story half told in the silence of the desert wind. And Genghis Khan, who had begun this journey by testing his army at the edge of the known world, had become something else too, not merely a conqueror, not just a Khan, but a man who had erased a kingdom to draw a line in the sand, a line that no future ruler would cross without consequence, because the Mongols remembered. And history, it seemed, had begun to speak with a Mongol accent.